stop scrolling, because this just flipped the entire narrative on its head. After weeks of whispers, assumptions, and reckless speculation, Pierre has finally broken his silence. And the reason he gave for his split from Teyana Taylor is not what the internet decided it was. No leaks, no scandalous confessions, no sensational reveal meant to feed gossip culture. What he addressed instead was something far more uncomfortable for people who already made up their minds. According to those close to the situation, Aaron didn't speak to correct rumors point by point. He spoke to reclaim control. Control over his name, control over his privacy, control over a story that spun wildly without his consent. And in doing so, he exposed something the internet doesn't like admitting. The loudest narrative wasn't the truest one, it was just the fastest. He reportedly made it clear that the split wasn't driven by secrets, labels, or betrayal, but by timing, pressure, and boundaries that collapsed under public intrusion. What was private became public too fast. What was still forming got dragged into speculation before it could breathe. And once trust eroded, not between two people, but between private life and public consumption, there was no path forward. The most shocking part? He didn't blame Teyana. Instead, he framed the split as two people realizing that once a situation becomes distorted by outside voices, clarity becomes impossible. That protecting peace sometimes means walking away quietly rather than fighting a story you never agreed to tell. And that silence wasn't guilt, it was restraint. Fans are stunned because this explanation doesn't satisfy outrage. It doesn't confirm the rumors people spread. It doesn't validate the assumptions that went viral. It challenges them. And that's why reactions are split. Some are relieved, others are angry. Because if Pierre is telling the truth, then a lot of people owe both him and Teyana an apology. Not for what they did, but for what the internet decided they did. And now the question isn't what really happened, it's why were we so ready to believe the worst without hearing a word from the people involved? Because once silence is finally broken, it doesn't just reveal truth. It exposes how fast speculation can destroy something real before it ever gets the chance to explain itself. In the silence Pierre kept wasn't empty, it was suffocating. For weeks, his name existed only in fragments, stitched together by screenshots he never posted, assumptions he never confirmed, and a narrative that outran him before he ever opened his mouth. By the time he finally spoke, the story had already been written without him. And that's exactly what made his words land like a rupture instead of a reveal. According to people who heard his explanation closely, Aaron didn't come out swinging. He didn't deny rumors line by line. He didn't attack Teyana Taylor. He didn't even center the breakup itself at first. He centered pressure, the kind that doesn't come from inside a relationship, but from outside voices crashing into something that was never meant to be public that fast. He reportedly made it clear that what ended things wasn't betrayal, it was distortion. When speculation began circulating, it didn't just intrude, it accelerated. What may have been private conversations, evolving feelings, or undefined territory was suddenly being narrated by strangers with certainty. According to Aaron, once that happened, the foundation cracked. Not because of what was true or false, but because trust can't survive when the world decides who you are before you get to decide for yourself. What stunned people most was how directly he addressed the elephant without feeding it. He didn't validate the rumors, he didn't repeat them. He acknowledged that something deeply personal had escaped into public space, and once that line was crossed, the relationship stopped being about two people and became about damage control. And that, he implied, wasn't something either of them signed up for. Insiders say Aaron emphasized timing repeatedly, that whatever existed between him and Teyana was still forming, still fragile, still undefined, and when outside pressure rushed it into a spotlight, it wasn't built to survive, the weight became unbearable. He framed the split not as a dramatic implosion, but as a quiet realization that something real was being consumed before it had the chance to stabilize. The most unexpected part of his explanation was who he didn't blame. He reportedly made a point of saying Teyana wasn't the enemy, that she didn't betray him, that she didn't owe anyone an explanation. In fact, he suggested that her silence mirrored his own, a refusal to turn private boundaries into public spectacle. And that framing alone stunned fans who had been waiting for a villain to emerge. Instead, Aaron pointed toward the machine, the speed of speculation, the entitlement to answers, the way leaks, rumors, and half-contexts get treated as confirmation once they're repeated enough times. He didn't accuse anyone directly, but the implication was sharp. Once the internet decides a story is juicy, truth becomes optional. People listening closely noticed how careful his language was. He didn't sound defensive, he sounded protective of himself, of Teyana, and of a version of the story that never got to exist without interference. He acknowledged that silence had been interpreted as guilt, but insisted it was restraint. That engaging would have only amplified something he never agreed to discuss in the first place. That explanation reframed everything. See, suddenly the breakup wasn't about secrets being revealed, it was about privacy being violated. Not by either of them, but by a system that treats curiosity as entitlement. Aaron's words forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. The loudest narrative was built without consent, and once it gained momentum, no clarification would ever travel as far. Fans immediately began re-evaluating the timeline, the abrupt distance, the lack of drama, the absence of public shade. In hindsight, those weren't red flags, they were boundaries. Two people choosing not to fight a narrative that was already out of control. Choosing exit over spectacle. What made this explanation even heavier was how it implicated everyone watching. If the split wasn't caused by scandal, but by intrusion, then the damage didn't come from inside the relationship. It came from outside consumption, from the way rumors were dissected, identities speculated on, and private lives treated like puzzles to be solved. Aaron's silence, once framed as suspicious, now looked like self-preservation. And that shift made people uncomfortable because it suggested the harm wasn't accidental, it was structural. The internet rewarded the most sensational version, not the most accurate one. And once that version took hold, it didn't matter what Aaron or Teyana said, the damage was already done. According to those close to him, Aaron didn't present this as a tragic ending. He presented it as a necessary one. That continuing under that level of distortion would have required either sacrificing privacy or constantly defending against narratives neither of them created. Walking away quietly, he implied, and was the only way to protect what little remained intact. That framing landed hard because it didn't offer closure people wanted. There was no confession, no scandal, no dramatic reason to point at. Just the uncomfortable reality that something ended because it was being consumed faster than it could exist. As word of his explanation spread, reactions split sharply. Some fans felt relief, grateful that the ugliest rumors weren't confirmed. Others felt anger, frustrated that the truth wasn't explosive enough to justify the chaos that came before it. And a quieter group felt guilt, realizing how quickly they'd accepted speculation as fact without waiting for a single word from the people involved. Aaron's decision to finally speak didn't end the story, it destabilized it. It forced a reassessment not just of what happened, but of how quickly the public filled silence with certainty. And in doing so, it exposed a harder truth than any rumor ever could. Sometimes relationships don't end because of what's hidden. They end because of what's exposed too soon. And this was only the beginning of that reckoning. The second wave of reaction didn't explode with outrage. It unfolded with discomfort. because once Aaron Pierre's explanation began circulating, the story stopped being exciting and started being reflective. People weren't arguing as loudly anymore, they were reassessing. And reassessment is far more threatening to a viral narrative than denial ever is. What immediately stood out was how Aaron's explanation refused to reward speculation. He didn't correct rumors one by one, and that choice frustrated people who had already invested emotionally in those versions of events. Instead, he zoomed out and addressed the environment that allowed those rumors to thrive. He spoke about pressure without pointing fingers, about intrusion without naming villains, and about loss without assigning blame. That refusal to sensationalize felt intentional and, for some, deeply unsatisfying. Listeners noticed how often he returned to the idea of consent. Not just romantic consent, but narrative consent. Who gets to tell a story? Who gets to define identity? Who gets to decide when something private becomes public? According to Aaron, once those decisions were taken out of their hands, the relationship changed shape entirely. Not because of betrayal, but because trust can't survive in a space where every move is being interpreted by strangers with certainty. That framing quietly dismantled the most popular internet theories without ever mentioning them. If the split was driven by public intrusion, then the supposed leaks weren't revelations. They were violations. And that realization forced some fans to confront an uncomfortable role reversal. The audience wasn't just observing the damage, it was participating in it. Commentary shifted quickly. Creators who had confidently discussed what really happened began hedging their language. Words like allegedly and speculation resurfaced. Some issued soft walkbacks, acknowledging that they may have leaned too hard into unverified narratives. Others doubled down, accusing Aaron of being vague to avoid accountability. The divide wasn't about facts anymore. It was about whether people were willing to admit they'd filled in blanks prematurely. Teyana Taylor's silence took on new meaning in this phase. Previously, it had been read as avoidance or quiet confirmation, depending on who was watching. Now, through the lens of Aaron's explanation, it looked more like alignment. Two people choosing not to engage in a public dissection of something that had already been damaged by too much exposure. Her refusal to clarify wasn't dismissive, it was consistent. That consistency rattled critics who had framed the situation as one-sided. If neither party was contradicting the other and both were emphasizing boundaries, then the internet's preferred storyline started to feel shaky. The lack of public conflict became evidence not of deception, but of mutual restraint. And restraint doesn't trend. Industry voices began weighing in with a different tone, less gossip, more caution. They pointed out how often early-stage relationships implode under public pressure, especially when speculation gets attached to identity. They noted that even unfounded rumors can destabilize something fragile simply by forcing premature definitions and defenses. In that context, walking away wasn't dramatic, it was protective. Aaron's emphasis on timing became central to this discussion. He wasn't saying this could never have worked, he was saying this couldn't work like this. That distinction mattered. It suggested possibility existed before intrusion accelerated everything. And that loss, the loss of potential, felt heavier than any scandal would have. Some fans expressed frustration that his explanation didn't give them closure. There was no villain to be held accountable, no shocking truth to justify weeks of chaos. But others recognized that discomfort as the point. Closure is a luxury gossip culture demands even when it's not owed. Aaron's refusal to package his experience into a consumable ending felt like a boundary reasserted late, but firmly. The conversation also began shifting toward responsibility, not legal responsibility, but cultural. How quickly audiences assume access, how often silence is treated as guilt, how easily identity becomes speculation fodder. Aaron's words didn't accuse, but they implicated, and being implicated without being attacked is often harder to dismiss. Quietly, empathy began replacing outrage in some corners. People shared their own experiences of relationships strained by outside opinion, by friends, family, or online commentary that moved faster than clarity. The story started to resonate not because it was scandalous, but because it was familiar. Many recognized the pattern, something personal becoming unsustainable once it stops belonging to the people inside it. Of course, not everyone was moved. Some argued that public figures have a responsibility to address rumors precisely because of their influence. They claimed Aaron's explanation was too abstract, too careful, too convenient. But even those critiques acknowledged one thing. His version didn't contradict Teyana's silence. It complemented it. As this phase settled, the narrative lost heat but gained weight. It wasn't dominating timelines anymore, but it was changing how people talked about it. Less certainty, more qualifiers, fewer absolutes. That's often the sign that a story has moved past spectacle into something more lasting, a cautionary example rather than a viral moment. By the end of this wave, the question wasn't what was the secret, it was what did we assume without permission. Aaron's explanation didn't erase the rumor's impact, but it reframed it as a symptom rather than a cause. And that reframing left the audience with something far less satisfying than scandal, accountability without a target. The story hadn't ended, but it had slowed enough for people to finally hear what was being said beneath the noise. By the time the third phase took shape, the story had fully detached from its original spark and become something heavier, a referendum on how silence to speculation and consumption collide. Aaron Pierre's decision to finally speak didn't ignite a new fire. It exposed the ashes of one that had already burned too hot, too fast, and without permission. What lingered now wasn't curiosity, it was consequence. People began to notice how little there actually was to argue about anymore. Aaron hadn't contradicted Teyana, Teyana hadn't contradicted Aaron. There were no competing versions of events, no public sparring, no messy backtracking. Instead, there was alignment through restraint, two people telling the same story by refusing to sensationalize it. And in an internet culture addicted to conflict, that kind of unity felt almost suspicious. Commentators who had built entire narratives around the idea of a hidden truth found themselves with nothing solid to hold on to. And the absence of receipts didn't feel like mystery anymore. It felt like finality. Not the kind that satisfies, but the kind that forces acceptance. This wasn't a story waiting to be cracked open. It was a story that had already closed its door. What unsettled people most was how ordinary Aaron's explanation actually was. No scandal, no shocking reveal, just timing, pressure, and the collapse of privacy under scrutiny. That ordinariness challenged the idea that every celebrity breakup must be fueled by betrayal or deception. It suggested something far more uncomfortable. Sometimes things end because the environment becomes unlivable, not because the people inside it fail each other. That realization shifted the emotional center of the discourse. Sympathy replaced suspicion in quieter corners. And not loud apologies or viral reckonings, just a slow acknowledgement that the internet had moved too quickly, spoken too loudly, and decided too much. People began admitting they'd projected, that they'd filled silence with certainty because uncertainty is uncomfortable. The phrase "he broke his silence" started to feel misleading. Aaron hadn't broken anything. He'd clarified boundaries. He hadn't offered access. He'd reclaimed it. And that distinction mattered because it reframed silence not as absence, but as choice. A choice that both he and Teyana appeared to share. As weeks passed, the rumor's afterlife became more subtle, but no less real. References didn't disappear, they softened. Jokes turned into footnotes, assumptions became shorthand. The names still carried association, but without the same venom. That's often how unresolved narratives settle, not with resolution, but with residue. Industry conversations quietly absorbed the lesson. Publicists and peers began talking more openly about the cost of early exposure, about how quickly a narrative can outrun reality, about the impossibility of correcting a story that never waited for facts in the first place. Aaron's explanation became less about him and more about a broader pattern, one many recognized but rarely name. Teyana Taylor's continued silence in this context felt less like avoidance and more like integrity. She didn't rush to co-sign or expand. She didn't contradict or correct. She let Aaron's words stand without amplification or denial. That restraint spoke volumes. It suggested trust, not just between two people, but in the idea that not everything needs to be litigated publicly to be true. Critics who still demanded more clarity began to sound repetitive. The calls for "just tell us what happened" rang hollow against the reality that nothing was owed. The story had crossed from public curiosity into private boundary, and Aaron had drawn the line clearly enough for those willing to see it. What remained was an uncomfortable mirror for the audience. If the breakup wasn't caused by scandal, then the frenzy that followed had no justification. The harm wasn't collateral, it was central. And that realization didn't inspire outrage, it inspired reflection. A quieter, more unsettling emotion. People began asking harder questions, not about Aaron or Teyana, but about themselves, about why they were so ready to believe something unverified, about why silence felt like permission to speculate, about how often they confuse access with entitlement. Those questions didn't trend, they lingered. Aaron's explanation didn't redeem anyone or condemn anyone. It simply removed the scaffolding that had held the rumor up. Without that structure, the narrative collapsed under its own weight. There was nothing left to dissect without crossing into outright intrusion. In the end, the real reason wasn't a secret waiting to be exposed. It was a boundary that arrived too late to save something still forming, a reminder that not every ending is dramatic and not every silence is deceptive. Some are protective, some are necessary, and some are the only way to stop a story from doing more damage than it already has. This chapter didn't close with vindication, it closed with restraint, with the understanding that truth doesn't always arrive loudly, and that sometimes the most honest explanation is the one that refuses to perform. The narrative that once felt inevitable now felt fragile, and that fragility was the final revelation, because it showed how easily something real can be undone by a story no one agreed to tell, and how hard it is to put that back once it's been consumed. What remains now isn't scandal, it's a cautionary echo, a reminder that silence isn't always empty, and speaking doesn't always mean exposing. Sometimes it means reclaiming the right not to be defined by a rumor that never deserved oxygen in the first place. Before you click away, sit with this for a moment, because this wasn't just a celebrity breakup explained. This was a rare moment where silence was finally translated, and in doing so, it exposed how quickly narratives can turn destructive when nobody waits for the people involved to speak. If this made you rethink what you assumed, don't let that discomfort fade. Hit like so this conversation doesn't get buried under louder, messier versions of the story. Drop a comment and be honest. Did this explanation change how you saw the situation, or did it raise even more questions? And subscribe right now, because stories like this don't truly end when someone speaks. They evolve when the internet decides whether it's willing to listen. Engagement matters here, not for drama, for accountability. When attention disappears, so does nuance. And once nuance is gone, speculation fills the gap again. This wasn't about choosing sides. It was about recognizing how fast silence gets weaponized and how rare it is for someone to reclaim their narrative without turning it into spectacle. Make sure you're here for what comes next, because the next time a story like this breaks, how we react will decide whether the damage repeats or finally stops.